You watched the first 3 videos in this series, but you still have questions. And of course you do. Evictions are really difficult. And that's why I'm bringing you this 4th video in the series with all of your most frequently asked questions about the eviction process. I'm Jennifer Rulins, landlord, educator, advocate, and broker at One Focus Property Management. You've asked questions and I have answers. So let's get started. What about the waiver of the notice to quit that I have in my lease? That's a question that people ask me all the time. So it's very common in a lease to have what's called a waiver of the notice to quit, where the tenant is waiving their right to receive that notice to quit before you file. So here's what you need to know. 1, this is legal to do. It is actually in the Pennsylvania Association of Realtors lease that they use. I don't use that lease, but it's in there and it's something that's been thoroughly vetted. But what I've experienced is that some district magisterial court judges do not like the waiver of the notice to quit. So I have heard cases in courts where judges will not permit you to not post the notice to quit. They've decided that it's not something that even if it's in the lease, that they'll acknowledge. I've also seen judges call up challenges to the waiver, claiming that it's not in plain enough language, that it hasn't been called out specifically enough in the lease. And so on our lease, it's bolded, it's in very plain language. And at the end of the lease where they sign, it's actually in all bold. Attention, you are giving up certain legal rights in this lease, and it's trying to direct their attention back to it. So there's just a couple of little pitfalls that you might need to be aware of. I still use the waiver in my leases. I don't think it's a reason not to, but it is a reason to be aware when you go to court. Now, the other question I receive is, if you have a waiver of the notice to quit, why are you posting the notice to quit? Well, at One Focus, it's our opinion that the use of that waiver is situational. So we start our eviction process on the 4th of the month. Our lease has a 3-day grace period to pay the rent, and on the 4th of the month, it's late. And that day is actually the day we charge the late fees and post the notice to quit, starting the process. It would be too aggressive, in our opinion, to file at the court on the 4th of the month. That would be simply too aggressive of a move for a landlord typically. Now, if we've had repeated issues with a tenant in a property, repeatedly non-payment of rent on time, we may, after working with them, decide to do a filing without a notice to quit, but that would be a repeated problem case. Another situation would be sometimes a tenant will pay rent with a form of payment and it doesn't clear the bank, but we don't learn about that for about a week after we've deposited it. So we find out on approximately the 10th of the month that the payment wasn't good. In that case, we sometimes will post the notice to quit, and sometimes, if this tenant has been delinquent repeatedly, not use it. I do tend to use the waiver more in cases where the behavior is violent, damaging, against the law, things like that. So you need to decide what's right for you. You need to discuss it with your own attorney, the strategies you're going to use, but that's how we make some of those decisions here at One Focus. You asked, can I evict a tenant in the winter months? Yep, sure can. I've never had any issues with weather or season being a factor in the judge's decision to issue a judgment for eviction. Now, I know in some cities, like Philadelphia, Baltimore, there are some different rules in larger cities sometimes, but speaking for most of Pennsylvania, the state, there's no rule that says that you can't. You asked, can I evict tenants from a property if there's a child or a disabled person living there? Yeah, you can. There's no rules about who's living in the property and whether that would affect whether the lease has to be followed or a judgment is issued. You wanted to know, do tenants appear at the hearings? Well, they're certainly invited. So when you file a landlord-tenant complaint against a tenant, this generally provokes some conversation between the two of you. If the tenant understands what's going on, understands that they've been delinquent on the rent or had a non-compliance issue, and they don't really challenge it, it is not uncommon for them not to appear. So nobody is surprised when the tenant doesn't show up at the hearing. And our most common experience is that tenants don't show up. But if they do show up, I think the concern for most landlords is about a conflict or about a bad experience. I'll tell you, when tenants come to a hearing, they're really generally pretty intimidated. They're scared, they don't know what's going to happen, and it's important to me that we ease that experience for them. I'm not interested in them having emotional distress because they're not going to make good decisions from a point of emotional distress. So when they do show up, and I encourage them to come if they can, when they do show up, they're kind of meek, they're kind of timid, and they're really just trying to advocate for whatever cause that they have in that situation. So they're generally open to some guidance. If they're not, of course, you can just leave them alone. You don't have to talk with them or chat with them or try to make them feel more comfortable, and that does happen sometimes. You wanted to know, what can you expect at the eviction? Do people freak out? And when I share with people that maybe I have an eviction appointment that day or something, that is something that they'll ask me is, oh boy, are you taking somebody with you, or are you taking a weapon? And I'll say, no, this is not a dramatic situation typically. So the most typical situation is at the point of eviction when the constable comes, and this is the point where you're actually taking the property back. Typically there's no tenants there. This is a 6 to 8 week process that they're getting notices of along the way, and hopefully you're educating them a little bit. They understand what the end of the road is, and they're not interested in being there. They're not interested in having their children see this, so they do usually tend to get out before the eviction. But I have seen it happen where people are living in the home just like normal at the time and date of eviction. And what I'll say about that is that they're generally pretty clueless when that time comes. So when that knock happens and you and the constable are there saying, hey, it's time for the eviction, you need to go, they're really dumbfounded. And they would have to be to get through that whole 6 to 8 week process, not understanding what was coming. So if you go to an eviction and there is a tenant there and and typically they're not acting elevated at all. They're really just trying to have their breakfast, get their kids to school. They're doing normal day-to-day things. So at that point though, the constable would be handling them, and they ask them to grab a bag and pack some things, and they try to get them out of the property probably with a max of about 30 minutes. The longest I've ever seen a constable wait is an hour, and that was for an elderly person who I think they had other issues going on, but they weren't prepared to leave, and they had to gather all of their necessities like medication and some clothing in order to go to another place. And so you can expect there not to be tenants there. If there are tenants there, the constable will take care of that. But generally, as long as you're not getting excited and in the mix, they're not getting excited or in the mix. This is a situation where everybody wants to keep their cool, so for the safety of all. You wanted to know, what are typical conditions of the property when somebody's evicted? Well, I won't hide anything from you. They're not great. They're usually pretty bad, and it's usually a lot of trash. So what it'll look like is what you imagine a property might look like after somebody went through it in an evening, trying to take anything that was worth it to their next location. So there's a lot of things on the floor, cabinets are open and partially unpacked. There's a lot of trash around. You have to imagine that this was that household's worst day ever. The day that they left the property and were being evicted forcibly. So you can't expect a lot, but you can expect a lot of trash out after an eviction. That would be the biggest thing I would say to expect. You wanted to know, what if the tenant leaves animals behind? And that's a tough one because it happens more than you think. Like I said, I've done a lot of evictions, and I've absolutely seen tenants leave animals behind in the property. And that's a really awkward and difficult position for any landlord to be put in, because the constable does not take care of animals. If you're in a municipality that has a really great animal control system, you might be able to get some help there. But in the communities I work in North Central Pennsylvania, you're really subject to the availability of space at shelters. So what you would do is you would get the animal. Sometimes you have to go get a carrier or find a way to get the animal out of the property because you can't be leaving it in the property, and you attempt to rehome it at a shelter or something like that. This can get difficult if you're in a community that has no spaces at the shelters. I have called tenants before and said, come back and get your animal, and tried to get them to participate in the process. But an interesting story, when I was a manager back in Harrisburg for a couple of years at an apartment community, we did a lot of evictions. We had to, and unfortunately for a while, people were leaving their cats. And I've never owned a cat personally, but I would take these cats to the local Humane Society. And when you turn in an animal at the Humane Society, you have to provide your identification, which I did. And I explained how I came to get the animal and what the circumstances were. And I remember this happened, 3 or 4 times. And I went with a cat to the Humane Society again. And when they took my ID and pulled it, they said, "This is the last animal you can bring here. You've actually reached your max." And I said, "Oh, really? That's really unfortunate, because I've never even owned a cat in my life. These are just cats I'm coming across." So I'm just here to tell you to be prepared, to know that that is something that you could face, and it is your problem to handle. Otherwise, it is in your property and, potentially going to be causing damage. You wanted to know, how can you get your money back? What about things that they leave in the property? Can you sell them toward that debt? The short answer is yes. So when it comes to getting your money back, a money judgment issued by a judge used to be listed in the public records section of the credit report. So if somebody pulled somebody's credit, they would see that there was a public record judgment against them and that it was a landlord and things like that. But that doesn't happen anymore. That law changed a couple of years ago, and now public record judgments do not show up on credit reports. So you can pursue wage garnishment. For my company, it does not work. The cost and the benefits do not work out. What works out well for us is using a collections agency. So once we've applied the security deposit against the balance and it's finalized and the tenant doesn't make payment or make payment arrangements on it, we will send that debt to a collection agency, which is great because it does appear in the credit report. They are actively pursuing that debt from the tenant, and it's on their credit report showing to future landlords that this is an issue they've had in their past. It encourages them to clear it up so that they can hopefully one day get another rental or a mortgage. So that's how we choose to get those judgments paid. Now, you're wondering, what if I find something of value in the property and I can sell it toward this debt to get my money back? Well, you can. That process is actually quite simple. So once those belongings are abandoned, so you've waited the required amount of time for the tenant to indicate their interest to come and get them, you've given them that opportunity. Once that is passed and truly those belongings are abandoned, you could go through them, find anything of value, attempt to sell them, and if you were successful in selling them, any proceeds would then go against the debt that that tenant owes you. In the event that you sold an item and it more than satisfied the debt, so you had excess money remaining, you would have to return that money to the tenant. And if you weren't able to find the tenant, you should be submitting it to the Treasury Department of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania in unclaimed funds. Now, that's all theory. I've been doing this for almost 20 years. I've done hundreds of evictions, and I have to tell you, I've never once sold anything that has come out of an eviction. Here's why. I've never found anything that had enough value in and of itself that it was worth going through the effort to sell and get the money back. Because it would have to be worth more than $100, in my opinion, to make my effort of going and procuring a buyer and doing a transaction to make that worth it. And truthfully, tenants just don't leave belongings of that kind of value behind in an eviction scenario. I suppose it's possible, but I've just really never seen it. And so I've never sold anything off of an eviction. I always just throw these things away, and the cost of the labor to throw them away and the disposal is charged back to the tenant. You wanted to know, how long does the eviction process take? Well, in Pennsylvania, the short answer is 6 to 8 weeks. But let's break down how that works. So if you're like us and you file your notices to quit on the 4th of the month, you would wait 11 days from there and be filing the landlord-tenant complaint on or about the 15th of the month. Truly, it's like the 15th to the 18th, depending on how holidays and weekends fall. So once you file the landlord-tenant complaint, you'll have a hearing in 7 to 15 days. So you can count on a hearing about 10 days after that. So put that at about the 25th, 26th, 27th of the month. After your hearing, you would have the 10-day appeal period, and then you could file the order of possession. So from the 25th, we're now forecasting out to about the 5th of the following month. And then once you file the order of possession, you'll have a date of eviction within about 10 days after that. And so from the 5th of the month to the 15th, you see how it takes about 6 weeks. It takes the 1st of the month prior to about the 15th to the 20th of the following month to follow that process all the way through. Now, that estimation is correct as long as there's no continuances requested or given. There's no problems with the judge's schedule where they're not able to hear your case as soon as is typical, and that there's no appeals. So that is the most typical time frame for our evictions and what we count on. You asked, how do I keep the tenant from freaking out, from attacking me, from behaving hostilely? Whew, that's a tough one, right? Because there's this notion that eviction is a violent, dramatic process and that tenants are going to behave unpredictably. And that's just simply not true. If we put ourselves in the seat of the tenant, they're going through a really scary process and they will say and do things that might be out of character, but it is from the stress that they are under. Truthfully, I think both parties in these situations tend to behave more aggressively because they're scared of potential conflict or of losing something through the process. So they kind of take on that aggressive standpoint defensively. It is my suggestion to you that you work really hard and with a lot of intention on remaining professional and pleasant through this process. It will do a lot to de-escalate any kind of emotions that might come up. I know that can be hard to do, but it is really important to keep yourself and the tenant safe that you maintain that pleasant professionalism. You know, most tenants really get freaked out when a notice to quit or an eviction notice from the constable is posted on their door. It's embarrassing, it's physical evidence of what's going on. Sometimes that's the first time that everybody in the house knows what's going on because there's been some evidence and maybe one person who handles the landlord relationship is now kind of been outed that this isn't going well. And so they think that when those things are posted that immediate action is going to happen and that it is going to be immediate, hostile, violent, and they're really scared. And so the most important thing we can do in those times is educate them. Educate them on this process. What does it look like? How does it go? I'm not scared of tenants knowing how this process works. And if I was, I certainly wouldn't make a 4-part video series and put it on my company's YouTube channel. So it's absolutely in my best interest that tenants know how this process works. I want them to be making the best decisions for them and their family. And if they're truly in a hardship that will keep them from complying with this lease agreement, it is inconvenient, but they usually get it. They've got to move. And if they understand the timing and the consequences of this process, they can make decisions to save themselves time, money, energy, burden, embarrassment, anything that they're worried about. And so I understand the landlord's position that they think that this is going to be a dramatic, escalated affair. And the truth is, I've been telling you through the whole series, that really depends on you, and you can control that outcome with your behavior. If I did not answer your question, I am so sorry. Will you tell me your question in the comments below, and I'll try to get it into a future video. Thank you everybody for the questions that you sent me, letting me know what you wanted to know more about this process. I hope to keep making videos for you, and I hope that you'll tell me what you want those videos to be about. I love making them for you. I hope you'll give us a subscribe and a like, and we'll see you next week.